Behind the medals, flags, and roaring crowds lies a side of the Winter Olympics few dare to confront. These are not stories of victory, but of lives shattered, dreams ended, and moments that froze the world in disbelief. Tonight we uncover 10 Winter Olympic tragedies that shocked the world and forever changed the Games. Georg Oberhammer. Not every Olympic tragedy unfolds beneath stadium lights or in front of cheering crowds. Some happen quietly away from the cameras, yet leave an impact just as devastating. At the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary, Georg Oberhammer, the Austrian team physician, was skiing near the Nakiska slopes. It wasn't a competition run. There were no medals on the line, no pressure to perform. It should have been an ordinary moment inside an extraordinary event. Then, without warning, circumstances shifted. Oberhammer collided with another skier and was forced off his line, drifting into the path of a snow grooming machine operating on the slope. The accident proved fatal. In a single moment, the festive atmosphere of the Games faded, replaced by a sobering reminder of how unforgiving the environment can be. What had felt like a celebration of human achievement suddenly carried a much darker weight. What makes Oberhammer's death so unsettling is that it did not occur during competition or in pursuit of Olympic glory. It happened away from the spotlight in a setting that felt routine and familiar. That is precisely why it resonates. At the Olympics, risk does not disappear when events end. Athletes, coaches, medical staff, and support crews continue moving through the same terrain, exposed to the same dangers. The mountains do not recognize titles or roles. They do not care whether you are chasing a medal or simply doing your job. They only respond to presence. Oberhammer's death was not tied to a race result, but it was undeniably linked to the Olympic environment itself. It revealed a truth often hidden beneath ceremony and spectacle, even beyond the arena. Even in moments that feel controlled, the risk never truly goes away. The Games continued, but the sense of safety did not. Kazimierz K. Skrzypecki. The Olympic debut of Luge was intended to highlight a new and thrilling winter sport. Instead, it began under the shadow of tragedy. At the 1964 Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, Kazimierz K. Skrzypecki, competing for Great Britain, was involved in a serious accident during a training run before the event had officially started. At the time, safety standards were limited. Helmets were not yet required, protective barriers were modest, and the sleds offered minimal stability at high speed. During one of his runs, K. Skrzypecki lost control of his sled and was separated from it, coming into contact with track infrastructure. He sustained critical injuries and passed away the following day. What makes his story especially heartbreaking is its timing. There was no official race, no opportunity to compete, and no moment under Olympic lights. His journey ended quietly before the Games had truly begun. Although the competition continued, the atmosphere had already changed. From its very first Olympic appearance, Luge revealed a difficult truth: the sport allows almost no room for error. K. Skrzypecki is remembered not for a medal, but for the legacy his loss left behind. He became the first athlete in Olympic history to lose his life in a Luge-related accident, a reminder that progress in sport has often come at a profound human cost. This tragedy happened before the Olympics even began. Do you think the Games should have been delayed, or should competition stop immediately after a death like this? Tell us what you think in the comments. Nancy Kerrigan. Figure skating is meant to represent grace, control, and precision. But in January 1994, just weeks before the Winter Olympics, the sport was pulled into a scandal that shocked the world. Nancy Kerrigan, one of the leading American skaters of her generation, had just finished a practice session at the U.S. Figure Skating Championships in Detroit when everything changed. Moments after leaving the ice, Kerrigan was approached by an attacker later identified as Shane Stant. The incident left her unable to compete and immediately raised questions that went far beyond sport. What followed was an investigation that uncovered a plot linked to figures close to Kerrigan's chief rival Tanya Harding, including Harding's then-husband Jeff Gillooly and an associate, Sean Eckert. As details emerged, the story rapidly escalated. It was no longer just about skating. It became a national spectacle involving motive deception and responsibility. Kerrigan's emotional reaction, her stunned question of why me, was broadcast around the world and quickly became a symbol of disbelief and betrayal. For weeks, headlines focused less on athletic preparation and more on courtroom developments and televised interviews. Despite the turmoil, Kerrigan recovered in time to compete at the 1994 Winter Olympics in Lillehammer. Under immense pressure, she delivered a composed and focused performance, earning the silver medal. Her achievement stood in sharp contrast to the chaos that had surrounded her in the weeks before the Games. The scandal permanently altered how figure skating was viewed by the public. For a time, medals shared the spotlight, with legal proceedings and Olympic coverage blurred the line between sport and true crime. Nancy Kerrigan's story remains one of the most unsettling chapters in Winter Olympics history, not because of what happened on the ice, but because of how far events off it managed to overshadow everything else. Dan Jansen. Some Olympic tragedies are not caused by accidents or equipment failures, but by moments of overwhelming personal loss. At the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary, American speed skater Dan Jansen arrived as a strong medal contender, carrying years of preparation and expectation. Then, on the morning of his first race, he received devastating news: his sister Jane had passed away after a long battle with leukemia. Despite the shock, Jansen chose to compete. In the 500-meter event, he took the ice under circumstances no athlete is prepared for. Midway through the race, his focus slipped and he was unable to finish as planned. The moment was painful to watch, not because of the result itself, but because the weight of grief was visibly present in every stride. Days later, Jansen returned for the 1,000-meter race, hoping for redemption. Once again, things did not go his way. The outcome confirmed what many already sensed: this was no ordinary Olympic disappointment. It was grief unfolding in real time under the glare of the world's cameras. The footage remains difficult to revisit, not as a record of athletic failure, but as a reminder of how deeply personal loss can intrude on even the biggest stages. Jansen would eventually find redemption years later, winning Olympic gold at Lillehammer in 1994. But for many, Calgary remains the defining chapter of his Olympic story. In that moment, the Games felt less like a celebration of sport and more like a stark reminder that athletes do not leave their humanity at the edge of the ice. Ross Milne. For Australia, the 1964 Winter Olympics in Innsbruck were meant to be a moment of pride. The country arrived with a small delegation and big hopes, eager to make its mark on the world's coldest sporting stage. Among them was Ross Milne, a teenage alpine skier competing far from home, chasing an Olympic dream that few Australians had dared to imagine. That dream was cut short during a downhill training run on the Patrickhoffel course. Milne lost control at high speed and left the racing line, suffering serious injuries. He passed away shortly afterward. The news stunned the Olympic Village and cast a shadow over the Games before they had even officially begun. What followed raised troubling questions. Witnesses later described the course as poorly managed and dangerously crowded during training. Dozens of skiers were reportedly on the slope at the same time, with people standing near turns and others crossing the track between runs. One competitor would later describe the situation as an accident waiting to happen. The timing made the loss even more devastating. Milne's death came just days after the fatal training accident involving Kazimierz Kajszczypecki, reinforcing a growing sense that safety had not kept pace with ambition. For Australia, it was a profound blow a young athlete lost before he ever had the chance to truly compete on the Olympic stage. Innsbruck 1964 continued, but the mood had shifted. Ross Milne's story became a lasting reminder that in winter sports, especially at the highest level, the margin for error can be unforgiving. His legacy is not measured in results or rankings, but in the lessons learned from a tragedy that changed how safety would be viewed in the years that followed. Nicholas Bochatai. Some of the most unsettling Olympic tragedies occur far from the finish line. At the 1992 Winter Olympics in Albertville, Swiss speed skier Nicholas Bochatai competed in the speed skiing demonstration event, a discipline built around extreme velocity and precision. It was a reminder that in this sport, performance is shaped as much by equipment and conditions as it is by the athlete themselves. After competition had concluded, Bochatai returned to the mountain to continue training on the same Olympic slopes. During that session, he was involved in a serious accident on the course and lost his life. The incident did not occur during a medal event and was not broadcast to the world, but it was inseparably linked to the Olympic environment. What made Bochete's death especially difficult to comprehend was its timing. The games were still underway, the venues were active, and athletes were constantly moving between training warm-ups and competition areas. His loss forced a sobering reassessment of what safety truly means at an Olympic site, not only during official events, but at all times. Bochete's passing highlighted a reality that is easy to overlook amid Olympic spectacle. Risk does not end when competition pauses. Mountains remain unpredictable, and speed magnifies every mistake. His death is remembered not because of a result on the scoreboard, but because it underscored how thin the line can be between preparation and danger at the highest level of winter sport. Joanne Rochette. Not all Olympic tragedies involve accidents on the course or failures of equipment. Some unfold quietly, carried entirely within the athlete. At the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, Canadian figure skater Joanne Rochette arrived to compete on home ice, surrounded by expectation support and years of preparation. Just 2 days before the women's short program, Rochette's mother, Therese, passed away suddenly after suffering a heart attack while in Vancouver. The loss was profound and completely unexpected. In a matter of hours, Rochette was faced with an impossible decision to withdraw and grieve privately, or to step onto the Olympic ice while carrying personal heartbreak. She chose to compete. When Rochette skated in the short program, the performance transcended sport. It was controlled, focused, and deeply emotional, earning her a personal best score and placing her in medal contention. Days later, she returned for the free skate and held her composure under immense pressure, ultimately winning the bronze medal. Rochette's performance became one of the most powerful moments of the Vancouver Games, not because of technical difficulty alone, but because of the strength it represented. It was grief expressed through movement, discipline, and resolve. In recognition of her courage, Rochette was awarded the Vancouver 2010 Terry Fox Award, honoring her perseverance in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Her story remains a reminder that the Olympics are not only a test of physical limits, but of the human spirit itself. Comment 1 if you believe Joanne Rochette's decision to compete was an act of incredible strength. Nodar Kumaritashvili. The 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver were meant to begin with celebration, but the Games were marked by tragedy before the opening ceremony even took place. During a final training session at the Whistler Sliding Center, Georgian Luge, Nodar Kumaritashvili was involved in a serious accident while preparing for his Olympic debut. Kumaritashvili lost control during the run and was separated from his sled, coming into contact with track infrastructure. He was transported for medical care but later passed away. The incident occurred just hours before the opening ceremony, casting a somber atmosphere over what should have been a moment of global celebration. The Whistler track had already gained a reputation for its extreme speed and technical demands. Following Kumaritashvili's death, immediate changes were made, including adjustments to the ice profile and the lowering of start positions. These actions reflected a difficult but necessary reassessment of safety standards at one of the fastest tracks ever built. Kumaritashvili's death became one of the most haunting reminders in Olympic history that spectacle and risk can exist side by side. He had trained for years to reach the Olympic stage, only to lose his life before the Games officially began. Vancouver 2010 continued, but the loss lingered, an enduring symbol of the human cost that can accompany the pursuit of Olympic dreams. Sergei Grinkov. Some Olympic tragedies don't happen during competition. They come later when the medals are won, the crowds have gone home, and the world assumes the danger has passed. At the 1994 Winter Olympics in Lillehammer, Russian pair skater Sergei Grinkov stood at the very peak of his sport. Skating alongside his partner and wife Ekaterina Gordieva, Grinkov delivered a performance defined by power, precision, and effortless grace. Together they won the gold medal, cementing their status as one of the greatest pairs in figure skating history. But the triumph masked an invisible strain. Pair skating demands extreme physical output, explosive lifts, relentless training, and constant repetition under pressure. In the months following the Olympics, Grinkov and Gordieva transitioned to the professional circuit, where the schedule was even more punishing. The performances were frequent, the recovery time minimal, and the expectations relentless. On November 20th, 1995, while rehearsing in Lake Placid, Grinkov suddenly collapsed on the ice. Efforts were made to revive him, but he was pronounced dead shortly afterward. He was just 28 years old. The cause was later identified as a massive heart attack, a shock to a sport that outwardly appeared elegant and controlled. Grinkov's death sent ripples through the figure skating world. There was no crash, no visible mistake, no dramatic moment of failure, only a reminder that even in sports built on beauty and balance, the physical toll can be severe and unforgiving. His passing forced difficult conversations about training intensity, athlete health, and the unseen costs of elite performance. Gretchen Fraser. At the 1948 Winter Olympics in St. Moritz, American alpine skier Gretchen Fraser made history. Competing just 3 years after World War II, she became the first American woman to win an Olympic gold medal in alpine skiing. It was a landmark moment for U.S. winter sports and a symbol of resilience in a world still recovering from conflict. But alpine skiing in the mid-20th century was far from the controlled discipline it is today. Courses where rough safety barriers were minimal and protective equipment was limited. Athletes raced at high speeds on natural terrain, fully exposed to trees, ice ruts, and unpredictable conditions. Every run carried real danger and injuries were common, even if they didn't always make headlines. Fraser returned to the Olympic stage at the 1952 Winter Games in Oslo, where she added a silver medal to her legacy. By then, the physical toll of elite skiing was widely understood but rarely discussed. Falls were accepted as part of the sport. Pain was endured quietly. Athletes were expected to compete through it. What makes Fraser's story relevant in discussions of Olympic tragedy is not a single catastrophic moment, but what her era represents. She competed at a time when safety lagged far behind ambition, when the margin for error was razor thin, and when the risks faced by athletes, especially women, were often minimized or ignored. Gretchen Fraser's legacy stands as a reminder that behind early Olympic triumphs lay an unspoken reality. Greatness was pursued in environments where danger was constant and survival was never guaranteed. Her success did not come from a protected system, but from courage in a sport that offered very little forgiveness. Ekaterina Alexandrovskaya. The most devastating Olympic stories are often the ones that unfold quietly, far from the spotlight, and long after the medals have been awarded. At the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, Ekaterina Alexandrovskaya made history as part of Australia's first pair skating team to compete at the Winter Games. Born in Russia and later representing Australia, Alexandrovskaya reached the Olympic stage at just 17 years old, carrying the weight of expectation, relocation, and elite performance far earlier than most athletes ever do. But the Olympic moment did not bring lasting stability. In the years following Pyeongchang, Alexandrovskaya faced challenges that never appeared on score sheets or television broadcasts. Injuries interrupted her career and forced repeated breaks from training and competition. At the same time, she began struggling with her mental health, a battle that deepened as uncertainty about her future in the sport grew. In July 2020, Alexandrovskaya died at the age of 20 after falling from a building in Moscow. Her death sent shockwaves through the skating world and reopened difficult conversations about the psychological pressure placed on young elite athletes, especially those navigating injury identity and the abrupt loss of purpose after the Olympic dream fades. There was no fall on the ice, no mistake during competition. Instead, her story represents a different kind of Olympic tragedy, one defined by isolation rather than impact and by emotional strain rather than physical danger. Alexandrovskaya's legacy is not measured in medals, but in the questions her life and death left behind about how athletes are supported once the applause stops. Audun Grunvold. At the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, Norwegian skier Audun Grunvold competed in ski cross, a discipline defined by speed-tight margins and constant risk. A former alpine racer turned freestyle specialist, Grunvold was known for his aggressive style and technical control qualities that carried him to the highest level of international competition. After Vancouver, Grunvold stepped away from Olympic racing, but he never left the mountains. Like many elite skiers, snow remained a central part of his life, not as competition, but as familiarity. The skills that once defined his career followed him into recreational skiing, where the environment can feel deceptively controlled. In 2012, while skiing outside of competition, Grunvold was involved in a serious accident and later passed away. The news stunned the skiing community. There was no race, no Olympic venue, no crowd watching, only the stark reminder that high-level winter athletes remain exposed to risk long after the medals are decided. Grönvold's story echoes a recurring theme in Olympic history. The line between sport and danger does not disappear when an athlete retires or steps away from the world stage. Experience does not grant immunity. Skill does not guarantee safety. Audun Grönvold is remembered not only as an Olympian, but as a reminder that for those who spend their lives on snow and ice, the risk is never confined to competition alone. Sometimes the most devastating moments arrive quietly when no one is looking. Dario Cologna. Swiss cross-country skier Dario Cologna entered the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi as one of the most dominant endurance athletes of his generation. Known for his efficiency, stamina, and mental control, Cologna had already proven himself at the highest level of the sport. But elite cross-country skiing demands relentless strain on the body. Long distances, extreme cold, and repeated maximum effort push athletes to physiological limits that are rarely visible to spectators. In the years surrounding his Olympic appearances, Cologna dealt with recurring physical setbacks, illnesses, and injuries that disrupted training cycles and forced difficult decisions about when and whether to compete. At the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, Cologna once again returned to the world stage under immense pressure, carrying the expectations of a nation and the accumulated toll of years of elite endurance racing. Competing through physical adversity, he delivered performances that masked how narrow the margin had become between peak condition and breakdown. Cologna's story is not defined by collapse or catastrophe, but by what it reveals about Winter Olympic endurance sports. The danger does not always announce itself through crashes or visible injury. Sometimes it exists in the slow erosion of the body, where athletes continue to perform at the highest level while quietly managing pain, fatigue, and medical uncertainty. His career stands as a reminder that Olympic tragedy is not limited to moments the cameras can capture. In endurance disciplines, survival itself can become part of the competition, and the cost is often paid long before anyone realizes how close the line truly is. If you believe no medal is worth the slow destruction of an athlete's body, hit like and comment too below. Vladimir Smirnov. At the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary, Soviet speed skater Vladimir Smirnov was one of the strongest contenders in the field. Known for his explosive starts and raw power, Smirnov entered the games with legitimate medal expectations in long-track speed skating. During competition, a catastrophic collision occurred when another skater fell directly into Smirnov's racing line. At full speed, there was no time to react. The impact caused severe head trauma and immediately ended his Olympic campaign. The arena fell silent as medical teams rushed to the ice, and the reality set in that this was no ordinary sporting accident. Smirnov survived, but the consequences were permanent. He suffered extensive brain damage that left him with lifelong physical and cognitive impairments. His career ended instantly, replaced by years of rehabilitation and dependence on care. The medals were forgotten. The podium never came. What remained was survival and the heavy cost attached to it. The incident forced the Olympic movement to confront uncomfortable questions about safety in speed skating. Changes to race formats and protective measures followed, but for Smirnov, those adjustments came too late. His life had already been irreversibly altered. Vladimir Smirnov's story stands as one of the most haunting reminders in Winter Olympic history that survival alone does not mean escape. Sometimes the tragedy is not the moment of impact, but everything that follows after the race is over. Vinko Bogataj. At the 1976 Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, Vinko Bogataj represented Yugoslavia in ski jumping, a sport where fractions of a second and subtle shifts in balance can separate control from catastrophe. Bogataj did not medal, but he left the games as a seasoned competitor determined to continue pushing his limits on the international circuit. Just 1 year later, in 1977, that pursuit would change his life forever. During a ski flying event in Oberstdorf, Germany, Bogataj lost control during his landing in difficult weather conditions. What followed was a devastating accident that ended his athletic career in an instant. He survived, but sustained severe injuries that left him partially paralyzed and forced him into lifelong rehabilitation. There was no Olympic podium, no dramatic broadcast, and no official ceremony to mark what had been lost. Instead, Bogataj became part of a different Olympic narrative, the one rarely discussed. Survival came at a cost. His competitive future was gone, replaced by years of physical and emotional recovery in a world that had already moved on. Ironically, Bogataj's fall became one of the most widely recognized images in sports history. Footage of the accident was later used in the opening montage of ABC's Wide World of Sports, accompanying the famous line, "The thrill of victory," and the agony of defeat. For millions, it became a symbol. For Bogataj, it was a reminder that behind iconic images are real lives permanently altered. Vinko Bogataj's story is not defined by death, but by endurance in its harshest form. He stands as a reminder that for winter athletes, the danger does not end when the Olympic flame is extinguished. Sometimes the true cost of competition is paid afterward in silence, far from the applause. Shi Liu. Ekaterina Gordieva. At the 1994 Winter Olympics in Lillehammer, Ekaterina Gordieva stood at the center of one of figure skating's most celebrated partnerships. Skating alongside her husband and partner Sergei Grinkov, Gordieva delivered performances defined by trust timing and emotional connection. Together they won Olympic gold, confirming their place among the greatest pairs the sport had ever seen. But the triumph was brief. Less than 2 years later, while rehearsing in Lake Placid, Grinkov collapsed on the ice and died suddenly at just 28 years old. In a single moment, Gordieva lost not only her partner but her husband, her future plans, and the structure that had defined her life since childhood. The skating world mourned publicly, then moved forward. Gordieva had to decide whether she could do the same. At just 23 years old, she faced a choice few athletes are prepared for: walk away from the ice entirely, or return to it alone, carrying grief into every movement. She chose to continue. When Gordieva eventually returned to competition and professional skating, her performances carried a different weight. The lifts were gone, the partnership replaced by solo routines, but the emotional intensity remained. Each appearance became less about medals and more about survival, about finding purpose after loss in a sport that never slows down for mourning. Ekaterina Gordieva's story is a reminder that Olympic success does not shield athletes from devastating personal tragedy. While records and medals are preserved in history, grief does not fade on a schedule. Sometimes the most enduring Olympic tragedy is not the life that ends, but the one that must continue afterward. Continue afterward. Continue afterward. Vladimir Smirnov. At the 1988 Winter Olympics in Calgary, Soviet speed skater Vladimir Smirnov was one of the strongest contenders in the field. Known for his explosive starts and raw power, Smirnov entered the games with legitimate medal expectations in long-track speed skating. During competition, a catastrophic collision occurred when another skater fell directly into Smirnov's racing line. At full speed, there was no time to react. The impact caused severe head trauma and immediately ended his Olympic campaign. The arena fell silent as medical teams rushed to the ice, and the reality set in that this was no ordinary sporting accident. Smirnov survived, but the consequences were permanent. He suffered extensive brain damage that left him with lifelong physical and cognitive impairments. His career ended instantly, replaced by years of rehabilitation and dependence on care. The medals were forgotten. The podium never came. What remained was survival and the heavy cost attached to it. The incident forced the Olympic movement to confront uncomfortable questions about safety in speed skating. Changes to race formats and protective measures followed, but for Smirnov, those adjustments came too late. His life had already been irreversibly altered. Vladimir Smirnov's story stands as one of the most haunting reminders in Winter Olympic history that survival alone does not mean escape. Sometimes the tragedy is not the moment of impact, but everything that follows after the race is over. Vinko Bogataj. At the 1976 Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, Vinko Bogataj represented Yugoslavia in ski jumping, a sport where fractions of a second and subtle shifts in balance can separate control from catastrophe. Bogataj did not medal, but he left the games as a seasoned competitor determined to continue pushing his limits on the international circuit. Just 1 year later, in 1977, that pursuit would change his life forever. During a ski flying event in Oberstdorf, Germany, Bogataj lost control during his landing in difficult weather conditions. What followed was a devastating accident that ended his athletic career in an instant. He survived but sustained severe injuries that left him partially paralyzed and forced him into lifelong rehabilitation. There was no Olympic podium, no dramatic broadcast, and no official ceremony to mark what had been lost. Instead, Bogataj became part of a different Olympic narrative, the one rarely discussed. Survival came at a cost. His competitive future was gone, replaced by years of physical and emotional recovery in a world that had already moved on. Ironically, Bogataj's fall became one of the most widely recognized images in sports history. Footage of the accident was later used in the opening montage of ABC's Wide World of Sports, accompanying the famous line, "The thrill of victory," and the agony of defeat. For millions, it became a symbol. For Bogataj, it was a reminder that behind iconic images are real lives permanently altered. Vinko Bogataj's story is not defined by death, but by endurance in its harshest form. He stands as a reminder that for winter athletes, the danger does not end when the Olympic flame is extinguished. Sometimes the true cost of competition is paid afterward in silence, far from the applause, Shi Liu.